the independent economist, Kanika Pasricha, the chief economic advisor at Union Bank of India, and Rakesh Mohan, the former deputy governor of the Reserve Bank of India. Let me start with you, Mr. Mohan, and ask you, he's worn multiple hats, right? From an RBI governor to, of course, the PMEAC advisor to the finance minister and the prime minister. What would you remember Dr. Manmohan Singh most for?
Thank you for having me on this show. I feel his loss very deeply and personally because I've had association with him since late 1980 at a very personal level. Let me, lot has been written, everything is known about all the policy reforms he did. Let me give a few glimpses of, in some sense, a view from the trenches on how the economic reforms took place. So the first point I would make is that he was very responsible for inducting a whole host of economic advisors, young economic advisors, right through the 1980s and 1990s, including Montek Singh Ahluwalia, myself, Shankaracharya, Arvind Virmani, Jayanta Roy, and others, and along with keeping a number of very active and like-minded civil servants who then were able to steer the economic reforms. In terms of his in terms of his bringing in very young people, so let me just give a very personal account. One, that I came as a senior consultant to the Planning Commission when I was only 32 in December 1980. And I didn't know him from Adam. He happened to be member secretary of the Planning Commission at that time. And I was only working on urban development. And it was his confidence in young people that within a year, he entrusted me with setting up 4 committees at the age of 33 on urban development. That's just by way of saying that he had so much confidence in young people that he encouraged them. Second, that the other methodology that he used, why the economic reforms stuck, was that he was very systematic in that, for example, in the 1990s, after the 1991 announcements of the reforms, he then formed expert committees under Professor Raja Chalaya for tax reforms, under Mr. Narasimham, a former RBI governor, on financial sector reforms. In 1994, he invited me to head a committee on infrastructure reforms on the report of which I gave in 1996, called the India Infrastructure Report, and many, many others. Abid Hussain also chaired various committees and many others. And the point is that the reason why many of the economic reforms continued over a period of time during his stewardship of the finance ministry in 91 to 96, which then continued under Prime Minister Vajpayee, and then, of course, during his prime ministership, was because of the very solid base that he gave through very thorough studies done by experts. So, whereas it is true that he could do a lot of these reforms because of the solid political support given almost freedom by then Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, who took care of the political ramifications and the political management of the reforms. But he was able to do a lot of this also because you mentioned everything that had been from economic advisor, chief economic advisor, secretary economic affairs, member secretary planning commission, deputy chairman planning commission, governor RBI, finance minister, because he had full domain knowledge of the whole economy. And therefore, he could do these reforms with great confidence. If there had been a finance minister who did not himself had internalized knowledge of the whole economy, and also had internalized the political ramifications of his of the reforms, that it couldn't. He had sort of full confidence because he understood himself. So I think that's a very important point.
How very right you are. And Shogato, let me come to you because, definitely one of the very prominent people who revolutionized our economy in his term as the finance minister during the 1990s. Tell us a little bit more about how you've read into his contributions towards the economy and governance.
So, thank you for having me on your show. And Dr. Mohan has been so comprehensive in his perspective on Dr. Manmohan Singh. So, I will concentrate more on his tenure as Prime Minister. Obviously, I mean, in his first term, he took on a sound economy and continued with the reforms, particularly the infrastructure, the public-private partnerships. In the infrastructure reform, he continued with those. And towards the end of his first term, he had to deal with this massive problem, the volatility engendered by the global financial crisis in 2008. His landmark during that period was getting the Indo-US civil nuclear deal passed, which enhanced ties with the US. So that was a huge part. And then he encouraged a lot. Dr. Mohan was Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of India. So a lot of the structural reforms around the financial sector also happened during that period. In his second term, there were a lot of measures that were brought in to provide a social safety net, particularly the Manrega program, the right to employment, right to education, a whole bunch of these, the reforms, the softer reforms, which contributed to the increase of equality in the system. I just wish that he had been a little bit more firm and decisive in his second term, given the travails of the Indian economy. But as he liked to say very frequently, very often, quoting Bismarck, that politics is the art of the possible. So I do understand the various constraints, but absolutely on an all-round basis, his tenure, throughout his tenure, has been a remarkable tenure, and certainly one of the most distinguished economists, technocrats, bureaucrats, ministers that this country has ever seen.
Bhattacharya, thanks for that view. Kanika, coming to you now, how would you describe Dr. Manmohan Singh's overall economic philosophy, and what lessons or takeaways do future RBI governors and future finance ministers of this country have to take from the legacy that he's left behind for us?
So first of all, thanks a lot for having me on the show. It's such an esteemed panel. I mean, not much to say after what Dr. Mohan and even Saugata has talked about. But just 2-3 points. See, there was a special book published titled Essays for Dr. Manmohan Singh on economic reforms of 1991. And it was all chapters by economists describing his reforms. And just 3 points that came out of it for, as a takeaway, which for me was, first, he was excellent in terms of crisis management. Which is why he got us out of that balance of payments crisis in 1991, and even out of that global financial crisis in 2008, 2009. But it was not just about short-term crisis management. He was also firmly focused on long-term structural reforms, something that Dr. Mohan talked about, the kind of committees they formed, which is what was the base of privatization, liberalization, globalization. Last but not the least, he was a champion of 2 key metrics in economic policy making. And first metric was macro stability. Second metric was, I would say, fiscal prudence. And if you see, even today, our economic policy framework is premised both from monetary and fiscal policy perspective on these 2 metrics of macro stability and fiscal prudence. But just from the current context perspective, while of course we are in a much more stable position, there is macro stability, but now we are coming at a juncture which, if I align with not just Dr. Manmohan Singh, which Dr. C. Rangarajan, who had also written essays on Dr. Singh, has recently pointed out, maybe somewhere we are coming at a point in growth trajectory where demand starts to constrain further impetus to growth policies via a supply boost. So demand becomes a major impediment towards further rise up in growth trajectory. And that, I would say, is the biggest takeaway. We are at a juncture where further upliftment of growth trajectory, both from fiscal and monetary policy perspective, requires a demand push rather than supply side measures. From the RBI governor's perspective, the focus on macro stability, and more so in a time when FX has come under a lot of pressure, there is global volatility and uncertainty, warrants more caution. So we firmly believe, in the broader view, while at that time Dr. Manmohan Singh just didn't pursue interest rate defense for rupee 1991, at the current juncture, it's not just about interest rate defense for the currency, but also looking at the broader macro stability before pursuing the prospects of monetary policy easing. Thank you.
Okay, yes, and we can go on with chapters and books and volumes as to what he's done, because his contribution to the economy has been really immense. But I want to shift focus, away from just the economic impact that he's had, Mr. Saugata, and talk about even as his work as the Prime Minister and the politician, because he was the last of perhaps a gentleman politician that we had seen, and he had done a lot in terms of things having a long-term impact. I know at that press conference he was questioned to be a weak prime minister, and he came back and said that history perhaps would be much more kinder to me than the contemporary media, and it's exactly playing out that way. But he brought reforms which were very, very future looking, whether it was right to information, whether it was, food security bill, whether it was those talks on the nuclear, energy with United States. How do you, kind of assess all of that and his contribution coming in for India and Indian citizens?
You're absolutely right that his contributions are likely to have a very long run in the future. The kind of reforms that he brought in, that he ushered in. For one thing, what Kanika talked about in terms of globalization, and particularly the deepening the ties with the United States. And remember that almost all the prime ministers before him and certainly after him have continued that stance, that his legacy in continuing ties with the United States and opening up India in general to a lot of other reforms, a lot of ties with other countries. A lot of FTAs were signed, remember, during that period. Free trade agreements with the ASEAN, with other economies were signed during that period. So the process of globalization was certainly accelerated during his tenure as Prime Minister. But together with that, remember that the current government, the NDA government, has taken on many of the measures that you talked about. I mean, he started off with DBT, direct benefit transfers. He started off with Manrega. So a whole lot of programs. The current government has just accelerated those programs. I mean, implemented them more efficiently, executed them more deeply, and accelerated the pace of their adoption. But the current government has indeed taken on many of the measures that you mentioned. That was instituted during the second term, sort of social safety. I remember that having read him in articles, in some essays on him, by him, that his focus was social equality. I mean, this was a very economic and social equality was very high on his agenda. So that, together with the reforms, that with high growth, and he also realized that this agenda would only be possible if the country were growing at a high growth rate. So together with this, I think that balance is what is likely to set him out.
Yes, and a tall benchmark, and of course big shoes for anyone to fill in. I don't think it's possible for anyone to do that. But thank you, gentlemen and the lady, for joining us today for this important discussion. And as I said, celebrating the life of former Prime Minister Mr. Manmohan Singh.